to The Artistic Vision, a podcast on theology and the arts, and newly sponsored by Creo Arts.
Brought to you by. We are representatives, ambassadors of sort of Creo Arts, which is a kind of a international, maybe not national, international arts collective.
We can call it international, like international sounds better.
Internationally renowned.
That's right. And on this first episode of being sponsored, we have what I think is going to go down as one of my favorite conversations. No offense to previous guests, but with Dr. Chris Green, who is a bishop, a church planter, a scholar at Southeastern University, a practicing artist, a family man. He is just a wise sage that passes on his wisdom to us today and encouraging things for artists, for pastors thinking about the liturgy and church planning. It was just a really encouraging, just kind of left field from this conversation.
Yeah. A lot of times people who talk with this sort of depth about the arts aren't artists. It's really good to hear from an artist himself and the way he thinks about art, the way God reveals himself to us in the world and the usefulness of our art. So really excited about people hearing this.
Yeah. Added bonus, we talk about one of my favorite film directors, Terrence Malick, one of our favorites, Flannery O'Connor, among others. So there's something for somebody in this episode. And I think particularly, don't jump to the end, but what he says at the end is his advice to artists could be anybody in the creative craft in this social world that we're in. Tune in. It's good. Enjoy this conversation. Here he is. Welcome to The Artistic Vision, Dr. Reverend Chris Green.
Good to be here. Glad we made this happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question we ask guests is, what's your beginnings with beauty? So were you raised in a home that appreciated the arts? Did your church growing up appreciate arts? Did you arrive later in life? What's your background?
Yeah, so definitely wouldn't have used the language of arts. I mean, it was a rural Pentecostal, old school Pentecostal setting. It was artful, but they would never have used that language. And it was, very blue collar, working class, poor working class kind of setting. But the singing, the preaching, the storytelling, I mean, that, now knowing what I know, looking back, I can see absolutely was artful. And there were sensitivities to beauty, but we would never name them as such. I think my first experience of beauty, at least the one that stands out as I look back over my life, I was very young. My parents had taken me to a museum, and there was a painting. I later met the painter and worked in an office near his, but it was a painting of a Kiowa warrior who is grieving. Later I put this together. I didn't know at the time. I was too young to have thought about any of these things. But it was a kind of surrealistic painting. So it looks like a representative painting of a Kiowa warrior who's grieving, and his chest and gut are hollowed out so you can see through him to the horizon. And the title of the painting was "Emptiness Has a Claim on Death," which was a line that was as much a part of the wonder of the moment as anything else. I didn't know what that meant, but that image and that line did something to me. And I mean, it reduced me to, I was weeping there in the museum, just kind of transfixed in front of it. And that, looking back now again, I can see how, that image and that line touched something really core for me. And my parents bought me a print of it for Christmas that year. It's hanging in my living room now, just in a room over from where I'm sitting. And that was certainly, I'm sure I'd had other experiences before that, but that's the one that affected me consciously and then shaped me from that point.
Yeah.
I appreciate you as a guest because you're an academic, you're a bishop and church planter, but you're also an artist. You talk quite a bit about contemplation throughout your books. I think in Surprise by God, you talk about human beings being meant for the work of interpretation, purpose to know God and all things in God. And then later in the book, you say everything comes down to how we perceive and interpret the world. And then in All Things Beautiful, it really is. You talk about the creative gaze, and I think Surprised by God, if I'm not mistaken, was actually a response to kind of the idea that God only appears in the fantastical. He appears in the ordinary, in suffering, even. How would you relate contemplation or interpreting the world to artists? What's the role of contemplation?
And I'll just add, the creative gaze is probably a better name than the artistic vision. We probably should have stolen.
Yeah, we should have stole that one.
Nice. Well, I think this is just what human beings are. I think the kind of animal we are is the animal that interprets, but not just for interpretation's sake. We interpret toward joy, toward peace, toward love. In that sense, I think to be human is to be priestly and to have this calling to bring God to bear on the world in ways that again are loving and peaceful and just, and merciful, but also to bring the world to bear on God in a sense. And we do that primarily through how we make sense of things. And that isn't simply intellectual, although it's bound up with it. I think there's an artfulness that goes beyond anything we could paint or anything we could say. I mean, ultimately, artfulness comes down to how we love. And in that sense, every human being is artful and is meant to live creatively. Like the best expressions of creativity are knowing how best to bring the life and light of God to bear in our neighbors' lives. And that can happen in poetry, that can happen in sculpture, that can happen in architecture, but it can also happen just in conversation, in the way you listen, in facial expressions, in posture. There's no limit to the ways in which that can happen. So I think for me, another way of maybe of coming at this is I do think it's something that every human being is called to, but there's no way of anticipating ahead of time what shape that will take in their life. Like precisely because of God's endless creativity, that God doesn't duplicate in any way. Not God doesn't do the same miracle again. And we get a long way, I think, if we think about our creativity as God's creativity shared with us, and not trying to square off how what we conceive of as the divine and what we conceive of as the human are kind of incompatible with each other. What's running through all my work is this conviction that nothing is more fitting than for God to be human, and nothing is more human than for us to be with God, and to be like God. And I think just letting that work on the way we imagine art and the life of the artist and creativity. I mean, that's what I'm interested in doing.
Yeah.
Can you talk about, like, I'm interested, especially for listeners who may not know you or your background. So I want to kind of like maybe tease out those vocations. You're a bishop, you're an academic, you're an artist. Number one, how, I guess, is the first one. And number two, like, how do you view those different vocations of your life?
Yeah, they feel relatively seamless for me. I don't think I certainly don't have any kind of plan for it. It just kind of happened. I think it is, again, I don't feel like I'm wearing different hats. That's a metaphor that people will draw on sometimes. I don't feel like I'm shifting modes. It all feels like one work to me. And now that might be a different story for the people I'm around. You'd have to ask my students and my kids and the people who have to work with me, whether or not that's true. But for me, at least, it doesn't feel distant. It doesn't feel like I'm, again, shifting from one hat to the next. And I think it goes back to having grown up amongst people who didn't really have a theory about art at all. And if they would have known it, they would have rejected it. But it was an integrative spirituality. I think what was best about the Pentecostalism, and there was a lot that wasn't good, but what was best about it is that it did believe that God integrates. And this is really what we meant when we talked about sanctification. And again, this is not language we would have given to it exactly, but that God, we come to God because our lives come apart, or are coming apart, breaking down, and God makes us whole. God heals us by drawing us together, by integrating us, and then transfiguring us into his likeness. And I think that that's at least how I experience this work. I mean, there's plenty about it that's painful, but I don't sense any pain shifting from kind of one work to the next.
You see kind of that integration in the work of one of my favorites, who you refer to as well, Flannery O'Connor. It's it's really clear that she doesn't set out kind of with an intention, like a moral of the story, for instance, but it just sort of, because of her integrated vision of the world, it sort of comes out of her. She says about good country people that the leg accumulates meaning, so to speak. You said it's fashionable, at least in some circles, to insist that art, unlike craft, is necessarily useless. So in her art was obviously very useful, but she didn't necessarily set out to make it useful, but it is because of that vision. I want to ask you about your own art, but before that, do you think that our artists in the church have been catechized by the culture because of a lack of understanding, maybe even a sacramental participation has limited our understanding of what it means to see the world as integrated?
Couldn't agree more. I mean, the holiness folks that raised me in the faith, they were more integrated than they realized, but at least their theory of things was, there's the stuff of God and there's the stuff of the world, and they should never meet.
Mm-hmm.
And they would have definitely classed art and creativity as belonging to the world. And there are all kinds of poignant examples of this, but one of them would be how often stories like Elvis or Jerry Lee Lewis would come up, because these were Pentecostal kids who made it in the world as, artists, as musicians, as rock stars, and so on. And that was for us always a kind of cautionary tale. Now, it had complexity because we were kind of witnessing to the fact that music is our music, that they learned to sing like that in our churches, which is true. I think. I mean, I think it's that kind of fusion of Appalachian and black, bluesy, soulful music. I mean, that was generated in these, at least in the churches that gave the energy to our movement. But then we saw them having given their gifts to the world as this kind of great betrayal, like that should have been given to the Lord. And what was right about that was this sense of, you can't hold your life together except in praise. Like that intuition is right, I think. And so when you read the tragic endings of someone like Elvis, it does seem like, yeah, there is something to his life should have been given to praise. This gift should have been given to praise. But what was wrong about it was this sense that there's a neat separation between church music and the music of the world, between art made for God that's about Jesus in an explicit way, and everything else, which is a diversion, or worse, some kind of betrayal of your calling. And I think that doesn't hold. I think if we had a more sacramental and missional sense of what it means to be human, we could see that, being faithful to your calling as an artist, and I think, again, that's a calling each human being has, it doesn't always have to have an explicitly sacred ecclesial shape by any means in order to be faithful. And I think O'Connor gets that as well. We're not.
Yeah.
One example of this I heard Martin Scorsese talking about how he wanted to be a priest, and some point in his training to be a priest early on, he didn't get very far into it, but one of his mentors had said to him, you can serve the Lord without doing it the way the first person you saw doing it well was doing it. That a lot of you have ended up in this space because you saw a priest fully alive and you're drawn to that. But what you're being drawn to is to being fully alive, not necessarily to the priest. And you've got to discern which is which here. And so I think for a lot of us, we've seen something, we've seen someone kind of fully alive, and we're drawn to that. And what we need to make clear to people is that's possible for each one of us, but it will look different. And for some of us, as in my case, and as in yours, Gary, you'll end up in the church serving in ordained ministry, and that's all to the good, but not for everyone. And what I don't want to ever do is suggest some kind of neat line between kind of faithful Christian life and what art looks like under those conditions and everything else as quote unquote worldly.
Right. Yeah. What would you say what use does your art have? Whether you know, when you feel inspired, whether you set out to say, hey, I hope that it does this or not. I think at the end of the day, what would you say? I hope this is the use of my art. Is it possible to define?
Yeah. So sure. Some of it is. I mean, some of it is for sure. There's going to be a lot more, it's like an iceberg. We can talk about the exposed tip of the iceberg that gives us a sense of what's going on, but there's so much that we don't see. But
yeah,
I think some of it is pretty straightforward in that if it's, for me, writing, whether that's writing poetry or writing fiction or drawing or painting, like some of that is just what we would call therapeutic. So some of it is just processing. And it's a way for me of getting things out. Yeah. And I don't think we should be too quick to dismiss the importance of that, right? That it can be what good it's going to do in someone else's life and what good it's going to do in my life. There may not be a neat straight line between those two things, right? So I've been working recently on some short stories, and I'm happy to unpack this, but I don't know that those will ever see the light of day, that anyone other than, my closest friends will see it. But it's done me good in that it is a way of, it's a kind of Ignatian exercise. I'm imagining and letting my imagination work on me. And that opens up ways of reading the text that wouldn't be there otherwise. Mm-hmm. And so I think it can be therapeutic. I think it can be imaginative in that it's training for your imagination.
Yeah.
It's helping you see the world differently. So whether that's drawing or painting or poetry, whatever it is, for someone, dance, I think it's very much not dance in my case, but whatever it might be for somebody. If it helps you process, as we say, and it helps you start to see the world a little differently, then it's already done a lot of good, even if it doesn't turn out to be that especially helpful for someone else. But I think it usually, if it's good, and what makes it good is not some abstract standard made by a professor somewhere. What makes it good is truthfulness and goodness that's somehow present in it. And if it's good, it will matter for somebody else. You just can't predict how or why.
Yeah, I think Baudrillard, I think I'm saying his name right. If I recall, talked about just the, sort of how the goal of art had become banality. Like it becomes its uselessness was what had come to define modern art. Yeah. And we sort of, I think even as Christians, became allergic to anything being useful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of it is those kinds of distinctions, like between use and uselessness, between art and craft. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think they're the kinds of categories that emerge when you've lost touch with the human vocation as priestly and with the world as sacramental. Like when when you've reduced everything to, visible and invisible, fact and opinion, like when you have a kind of a reality that's been drained of mystery.
Mm-hmm.
We're now, thanks to Charles Taylor, we're used to calling that a kind of disenchanted reality. I don't think we were ever disenchanted. I think we lost language and an awareness for how mysterious reality actually is. So we were still living in a mysterious reality. We just didn't have a framework or language for talking about it well. So we're kind of caught between what seemed like a division. And I think artists always knew better, even if they couldn't articulate it. And we knew better at some level, but weren't sure how to hold it all together. And I think this is where kind of pre-modern theology is so helpful, because it is rooted in mystery and the mysteries, the sacramental realities that I think are being recovered now. I think this is part of the reason so many people are being drawn to sacramental and liturgical traditions, is that starts to give language for what reality actually is anyway.
Right.
So all that to say, like, a lot of conversation in modern aesthetics, I think is a complete dead end, because it's starting from the assumption that the world is not mysterious.
Right.
And we're going to go wrong always in that case, because the world is actually mysterious.
Right. Good.
Oh man, there's so much there that I want to explore. I don't know if I have time. Let me ask a first question there. In what way, like in this recovery of mystery, this recovery of language that liturgical or sacramental churches kind of may possess, holy smokes. In what ways do you see that language both being inherited and stewarded forward as you're thinking about, like as a bishop, as you're thinking about planning churches, liturgical sacramental churches? Is it, as you're maybe instructing church planners or pastors, is it just inherent in the shape of worship, or is there something more? And what is it then that's inherent in worship that is kind of attracts the beauty?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's one I think it's really hard to answer simply. So let me kind of start down two lines, although I really want to talk about 7 or 8 different lines of thought, but I'm gonna limit myself to 2, so to honor your time. But one is, I think it's risky to be drawn to worship because it's beautiful. The key of worship is to worship God, and right away, the God we're worshiping is the one whom Isaiah says has no beauty. So, I end up in a lot of conversations where people will reference that line we attribute to Dostoevsky, beauty will save the world. And if by that we mean the God who is beautiful will save the world, yes, that's true. Or the beauty of the gospel will save the world, yes, that's true in some sense. But if by that we mean, if we just give our attention to things we find beautiful, we'll be okay, I don't think that's true at all. Because I don't think that Jesus and the gospel is something we would just find beautiful apart from the Spirit sensitizing us to what this beauty is. Like, I don't think that beauty always appears to us as beauty because of our own brokenness, our own disorientation, and the ways in which we've suffered and made the world to suffer. So I think we have to be careful not to try to sell traditional worship, high church worship, as beautiful and therefore good. What matters is that worship is true, and it's true insofar as it turns our attention to God as he actually is. And I do think there is a beauty in that, but there's not a reason, that's not an ultimate reason to do it. It makes me anxious when people say, they're drawn to high church worship because the worship is beautiful. And there is a beauty in it, but the beauty of the God we're adoring is an acquired taste, right? Because he has no beauty. And another example of that is the scriptures themselves. And if you look at what we call Christian scriptures, there is so much in it that's beautiful. Think of the Psalms, think of the stories in Genesis. I mean, those are absolutely beautiful works of art. And, just in terms of literary quality, will rival anything that's ever been written. But you also have, letters like 2 Corinthians that aren't artistic in that same way, right? They're people talk all the time about the Greek of Revelation, how how unskilled it is. Now, I think there's something astonishing about the visions in Revelation, but you're going to miss what Christian scripture is if you're thinking about it in aesthetic terms. And I think we can make the same mistake that fundamentalists made about the scientific questions when they lived in a world in which scientific accuracy was the highest value. So they had to make scripture hold scientific accuracy. Like it had to be perfectly accurate in every detail from Genesis to Revelation, or the whole faith comes apart. And I think it's possible to try to do that with scripture too, to say, that what makes scripture, how we know scripture is true, is how beautiful it is. And there is beauty as we recognize it in scripture, but there's a lot in scripture that isn't beautiful, that isn't holy because it's aesthetically perfected, right? And its lack of polish, its lack of kind of aesthetic value, as we like to talk about it, I think is testament to something authentic that's taking place there, right? So I think those two examples kind of, I hope, Alex, start to answer your question with it. It's complicated. It's complicated, and then there's a mystery that holds that in being, and we have to be really discerning, because I don't want to become someone who's in love with beauty, not the God from whom beauty comes.
Yeah.
And I think there's a way in which we need that cross pressure. Like, as much as we want to celebrate the beautiful, we need pressure cutting back against us that warns against what it would be like to be mesmerized by something I find beautiful, but isn't in fact true in the way the gospel is true.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like maybe maybe I've been trained to see like beauty, like the through line of beauty. If I love beauty, it takes me to the creator of beauty. And beauty is useful insofar as it does that. The liturgy is beautiful insofar as it does that. But maybe there's things that are attractive or beautiful in their own sense that don't draw me into the gaze of God. And those things are beautiful in a sense, but not ultimately beautiful or something.
Well, yeah, and some of this is tricky because we might be using the word in entirely different ways. But let me give the example. This is a kind of analog for what I was saying about scripture. Augustine famously says that he's kind of drawn back to the faith in part by Ambrose's rhetoric, right? That the skill of Ambrose the preacher kind of keeps his attention. But then what actually turns his heart is hearing that little child sing, take up and read, and then, he opens to Romans and the rest is history. I think there's a way in which what we are calling beautiful, what we find attractive, alluring, desirable, absolutely can be a way that the Spirit uses to lead us into life. But the Spirit can also use things that are, by all accounts, ugly, by all accounts, like not just unpolished, but truly broken. And I think we experience this in our own lives all the time. That there are certain moments in which having beautiful words to say to someone else is the right thing. Right. So if I'm celebrating, let's say, Alex, you have a particularly wonderful thing happen, and my words to you are beautiful and fitting to that moment, you're going to be deeply grateful for it. But then let's say you suffer some terrible loss. If I have beautiful things to say about that terrible loss, it's probably not appropriate to say to you, because what you would rather see is me crying with you me broken with you, not having beautiful words to say about what you suffered. Now, with some distance, you might want to read beautiful words about what you suffered and find comfort in them. But in the heat of the moment, what's needed there are not beautiful words, but the brokenness of what cannot be said. And I think that's getting closer to the way that we want. And that's what I mean by being creative. True creativity is knowing, not can I find some poetic way of speaking about suffering, but can I suffer with those who are suffering? And when that gives rise to beautiful words, well and good. But more often than not, it's going to give rise to groans that cannot be uttered, to broken speech, not speech that's somehow perfected. But here's the mystery. For us as Christians, that is beautiful. Right? Nothing is more beautiful than weeping with those who weep and not having slick words to say. So that's why it's kind of hard to talk about, because if we've been captured by the vision of the God who is crucified, then what we mean by beauty and what any particular culture calls beautiful there's always going to be an asymmetry there.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that is a great maybe segue into this next question, which it stems from your writing about Terrence Malick's A Hidden Life, which I'm a big fan of. But you talk about um, this that when something reminds us of something that's terrible, you say they never quite radiate the terrible beauty that makes our hope something other than wishfulness. Can you talk about how you see A Hidden Life being kind of a sort of wishfulness, but also then what a terrible beauty maybe more fully encapsulates in this vision of beauty that you're describing?
First of all, I mean, you'd have to go a long way to find someone who loves Malick's work more than I do. And someone gave me the gift of sending that book to Malick, and I got an email at one point from his assistant saying that Terry had read it and was encouraged by it. So
Great, that's
I'm
great.
quite happy about that.
Yeah.
But
There's a biography that just came out on Malick that I know that Alan Jacobs has written about, and then Alan Jacobs is writing a biography on Malick that I
I
can't
didn't
wait
know
to.
that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
astounding. Well, I will, yeah, cue me up for that for sure.
yeah.
So I think yes, that's what I was trying to get at there. And in my response to A Hidden Life, I'm drawing a contrast between the way that Hidden Life shows us a saint and the way in which in Malick's other films, say Tree of Life, we brush up against not the saintly, but a kind of holiness that's at work on those who are not saints. And there's a kind of paradox here in that I think the lived life of Jägerstätter, right, is holy in a way that the lived life of Jack is not. But artistically, we come up against the holiness that's working on Jack and his sinfulness in a way that's harder to see when you're telling the story of the saint. And it doesn't, and this is what's terrible about the beauty is kind of only visible when it's working on someone who's terribly in need of it. And this is I think what makes O'Connor's fiction so incredible, is that there really are very few, if any, good people in them. And precisely that, there's a kind of goodness that shines through, not through them, but at work on them, often in spite of them. And now, who would I rather be neighbors with? Right? Like who do I want to imitate? That's a different story. And I
Yeah.
think that part of what's hard, I don't know. I think this is part of the reason it's really, 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 really hard to tell a story about a saint that does to us what the presence of a saint would do. So being in the presence of someone who's saintly, and I've had that privilege, and I think we all do at some point, is it works on us in a particular way. But stories about saints, it's really hard for it to have that same effect. That's what I'm trying to get at there. And I think Malick does as well as you can do telling us a story like that. But it's not a failure on his part or the failure on Jägerstätter's part, but it is it's hard for us not to see those stories and either to think we will never be able to do that that's a kind of hero story I can never live up to. And well, here, let me say it like this. I don't think being inspired is ever the way holiness affects us. I think it humbles us. I think it awes us. I think mostly though what it stirs up in us is compassion and gratitude. And if we're going to tell stories of saintly people who themselves are going to be filled with compassion and gratitude, how are we going to tell those stories so that the effect of the story is to stir compassion and gratitude, not a sense of either inspiration, I want to be a saint too, or a sense of intimidation. I could never do that. I don't have that in me.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's making sense, Alex, but it's a there's a fine line there that I think I talk in another chapter of the book about the difference between the Jesus of Gibson's Passion, played by Jim Caviezel, and the private wit in Thin Red Line, also played by Jim Caviezel. And I argue that in terms of the effect on the viewer, that not playing Jesus, Caviezel is more like Jesus. There's something about who Jesus actually is that comes through in his dreaminess, in his grief, that doesn't come through when he's playing Jesus. So like there's a mystery there that I'm trying to name.
Yeah, no, I see that like delicate balance, but it makes a lot of sense. And the challenge of telling stories or making art that can do that well is a challenge.
Yeah. And it's part of what makes, when it works, that's where the miracle is. That's what's so deeply moving is when someone captures that delicate balance.
Yeah, that's great.
I love about the way Flannery, I think in many of her stories, if not most of them, the villain, you could argue, is actually her imagining herself. And like, it's almost more saintly for me to be drawn into the life of someone who is like, I'm the lady in Revelation who thinks of other people like that. I am. There's just something about the humility of the stories when you're placed in those places, and she's not a hero, but is deeply broken, but so resonates with us.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, one example of this from my own experience, which I don't write about in the book, is reading Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, which has one of the subplots is a story about Pontius Pilate, who's desperately wanting to get with Jesus again. He wants to have this conversation with Jesus again. And at the very end of the book, spoiler alert for everyone, he gets that chance. And I finished the book on a plane years ago. And when I got to that line in which I'm going to cry now thinking about it, when Pilate is told the master is waiting for you, and he gets to stumble down the path to talk to Jesus again after all this time. Like it undid me, right? Because what I was experiencing is this sense of just the unfathomable mercy and creativity of God, right? And that is in this figure Pilate and this novelist and set into just absolutely bizarre world that Bulgakov creates. That's a mockery of almost everything, but right in the middle of that absurdity, that you get this kind of just lightning bolt of the goodness and creativity of God. And that's, I think, what we're striving to let come through in our writing. And this is why we have to be careful not to predict where that might come through, right? How that might come through. And it's back to what we were saying earlier in the conversation. This is why kind of facile difference between the church and the world doesn't get us anywhere, right? Because that's a novel about a biblical figure, but it's not trying in any way to be Christian.
Mhm.
But precisely because it has the courage to imagine a way in which God might be merciful to Pilate. Like, and again, not in some trite way, but a creative way, truly creative way of imagining how God might be merciful to Pilate. I think that's what we're trying to get done in whatever art we're trying to make.
That's beautiful. There's about 7 more questions I want to ask you, but for the sake of time, it's really, really fascinating and great conversation. Again, thank you. But last word we give our guests is we have lots of, I don't know if lots is the right word. We have some artists who are Christian who are wanting to be faithful in their vocation. And so, what would you like to say to them?
I think be open and make offering. I mean, I think that whatever comes to you, like, first of all, we probably should have talked about this. Like, there's this line in Paul, what did you have? What do you have that you did not receive? And one of the ways we have to think about creativity is it's not that there's no effort to it. It's not that there's no craft to it. It's that ultimately, if there is something beautiful or true or good, it comes to us. We're not the source of it. It comes to us. And the way to make sure that it comes to you and that you handle it well when it comes to you is to give it back. It is if it comes, don't possess it. Don't claim it. Don't act as if you've generated this or if somehow, that you have the brand for it. Like you offer it and feel that. I think we should feel about our art this kind of gratitude that it came. For whatever it is, I'm glad it came. And if it never comes again, then I'll trust that that's as it should be. But I want to share it in that spirit. Not look at this thing that I've made, but look at this that came to me. Isn't this a wonder? And I think so for a lot of artists, there's this kind of tension about creating and sharing their work. Is it about self-promotion? Is it about, it's very easy to get trapped in questions about ego and then measurements of how good something is,
Yeah.
And as people who are following Jesus, like that just cannot enter into our mind at all. Like I'm thinking about Jesus taking the loaves and the fish, blessing them, breaking them, and giving them out. Like if something ends up in your hand, a song, a painting, a poem, give thanks for it. Do as well by it as you can and share it in that spirit of this came to me. And I offer it back. I think that like that sense of both receiving and giving, that posture has to be essential. And when work comes to you and moves you, it will move other people too, as long as you don't cling to it or try to make it into something for yourself. But I think some of it is just breathing a little easier. Don't get trapped in questions about ego. Just receive with joy and give with joy.
Yeah.
That's pretty good last word.
Yeah, that was good.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dr. Thanks so much for your time being with us, man. It was such an encouragement. Thank you.
Yeah, it was a joy. I'm glad we made it happen.
Mm-hmm.